July 1961. It's the height of the Cold War. The Soviets' newest and deadliest nuclear submarine is on her first combat patrol in the Norwegian Sea. Under the command of Nikolai Zativ, K-19 is state-of-the-art and armed with 3 nuclear ballistic missiles. U.S. President Kennedy and Soviet Premier Khrushchev are closer than ever to all-out war over the Berlin crisis. Then, deep in NATO waters, a catastrophic failure hits one of K-19's reactors. Radiation spreads throughout the submarine, and a full-scale meltdown is imminent. Zativ and his crew must fight for their very survival. This is the true story of one of the Soviet Union's most secret failures of the Cold War. Autumn 1960. The Barents Sea in the Russian north. The most technically advanced submarine in the Soviet fleet is tested to the limits of her capabilities. K-19 is the USSR's first atomic-powered missile submarine, able to launch a nuclear missile on an unsuspecting enemy within 3 minutes. It's a lethal combination of nuclear power and nuclear weapons. The Soviets are counting on her success. K-19 is a technological marvel and a political triumph. She's the latest addition to Khrushchev's nuclear arsenal. In the late 1950s and early 60s, the superpowers are obsessed with nuclear weapons. Ballistic missile technology is changing the balance of power. With the launch of Sputnik in 1957, the Soviets reach space first. It's a propaganda triumph and the birth of the intercontinental ballistic missile. Sputnik is put into orbit by the same rocket that can deliver a nuclear warhead to the United States. Soviet Premier Khrushchev's boasts of nuclear superiority instill fear in America's leaders, and he uses his apparent nuclear advantage in the high-stakes poker game of international politics. K-19 is one of his nuclear ace cards. Khrushchev decides his navy will be a submarine navy. Large surface ships will be a thing of the past. During a state visit to the United States in 1959, he reveals his plan. Russia's most lethal submarine, K-19, is placed under the command of Captain Nikolai Zativ. Only 33 years old, Zativ has risen rapidly through the ranks of the Soviet Navy. Vladimir Vagonov was Zativ's first officer.
They chose one best submariner from each of the Soviet fleets. There were over 100 diesel submarines in the Black Sea Fleet at the time, and they had to choose just one man.
Innovative and iron-willed, Captain Zativ is one of the few trusted submarine captains capable of taking K-19 to sea. He leads a crew of 139 men. Most of them are barely 20. Even the average age of his officers is 26. These men are the elite of the Soviet Navy and pioneers in a nuclear revolution.
Испытание головного корабля
When a head ship is being tested, the testers are the crew. They basically do what test pilots do when a new plane is being tested.
Zativ and his crew are also trailblazers, leading the way to a new type of undersea warfare. But K-19 will also turn into a killer of Soviet sailors, and earn the nickname Hiroshima Submarine. Before the atomic age, submarines are powered by diesel-electric engines. They can only stay submerged for a few days at a time. Then they must surface to draw fresh air and recharge their batteries. In the mid-1950s, nuclear propulsion forever transforms the submarine, allowing subs to stay submerged indefinitely. It starts in the United States with Nautilus. The race is on. The Soviet Union launches its own nuclear sub, the Leninsky Komsomol, just 2 years later in 1958. K-19 is launched on October 11, 1959. She's unbelievably fast, nearly double the speed of her diesel counterparts. She can cruise submerged at a speed of 26 knots, or 30 miles per hour. At 5,000 tons and 377 feet long, she's the pride of the Soviet Navy. At the heart of K-19 are 2 nuclear reactors, which provide limitless energy to power the sub's steam turbine propulsion system. It's new, dangerous technology that must be handled very carefully. For the Soviets, K-19 is a technological achievement without precedent. It took less than 2 years from construction to its first mission, according to K-19 designer Sergei Kovalev.
Система управления самими ракетами, это и навигационный комплекс.
Neither the design bureau nor the manufacturing plant had any relevant experience. So all the issues we now take for granted presented problems which had to be solved as fast as possible while the sub was being built.
K-19 is the Soviets' response to a new American threat. In 1960, the Cold War takes another technological leap that will define the conflict until its end. America perfects underwater ballistic missile launches from atomic submarines with a daring program called Polaris.
Another achievement of major strategic importance for America's defense.
Nuclear submarines are mobile and silent. Their missiles can be launched from anywhere, unseen. K-19's been designed to lie in wait off of America's shores, ready for the order to fire. She's armed with the latest in Soviet missile technology. Her 3 R-13 missiles have a 375-mile range, soon to be increased to 800 miles. Unlike the U.S. subs with their underwater-launched Polaris missiles, K-19 can only fire from the surface. The Soviets aren't far behind, however. They will have underwater missile launching perfected within 12 months.
All planned military attacks were targeting, first, command posts of the U.S. military administration. Second, strategic aviation airstrips. And third, U.S. submarine bases for submarines of the Norfolk type. That is, nothing but military facilities.
Throughout 1960, Captain Nikolai Zativ and his first officer, Vladimir Vagonov, take K-19 on her sea trials. They'll test her revolutionary new ballistic missile and nuclear reactor systems.
After the testing of the missile weaponry, the firing practice by the missile weapons, the torpedo weapons, practicing all types of attacks, the submarine is cleared for combat, for carrying out independent combat patrolling.
Completing her sea trials, K-19 joins the Soviet Northern Fleet, just as the Cold War is heating up. In January of 1961, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev has a new adversary in the White House, John F. Kennedy.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
He narrowly defeats his Republican rival Richard Nixon and delivers a stern warning to the Soviet Union.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
The older and more experienced Premier Khrushchev believes he can politically outmaneuver the neophyte president. June 1st, 1961, Severomorsk submarine base. As politicians confront each other on the world stage, K-19 Captain Nikolai Zativ receives his orders. Zativ's mission is to take K-19 on combat patrol in the North Atlantic for 3 weeks. He will also take part in a massive Soviet naval exercise. A show of force, codename Arctic Circle.
The whole plan was completely new to me. New crew, new all-important orders to show everybody what a new Soviet nuclear sub was capable of. At the time, we had more spaceships than the subs of K-19 type.
The Soviet war games are more than just a training exercise. They will show the United States that Soviet forces are ready and mean business. June 18th, 1961, Zapadnaya Litsa submarine base. After more than 2 weeks of preparations, K-19 is ready for her first combat patrol. Captain Zativ steers her out of the top-secret base and into the Barents Sea. An injury prevents First Officer Vladimir Vagonov from joining his captain on this mission. He's lucky. Vagonov is replaced by Captain Vladimir Yenin. Zativ records no recollection of feeling the history of the moment.
I looked at the sunny horizon, shut a hatch to the upper tower, and ordered to submerge to the depth of 500 feet. There was no omen on that fatal mission.
Zativ steers K-19 west into the Norwegian Sea, heading towards the NATO-patrolled waters between Iceland and Great Britain. It's a time of high tension in Europe. The crisis over Berlin is bringing the superpowers to the brink of war. The Soviet leadership wants Berlin locked behind the Iron Curtain. The West wants to keep Berlin a free city. The day after Captain Zativ receives his orders, Premier Khrushchev and President Kennedy meet in Vienna. President Kennedy's special counsel, Theodore Sorensen.
Particularly on Berlin, they clashed just as their interests clashed. And Khrushchev had warned that he was going to take action on Berlin.
Khrushchev thinks he can bully Kennedy and use his nuclear advantage to force the Allies out of Berlin. K-19's first combat patrol could end with World War III. Western ships and aircraft patrol the seas leading into the northern Atlantic. K-19 must pass around this line and remain undetected. It's Captain Zativ's first real test. K-19 is fast, not quiet. But what she lacks in silence, she makes up for in strength. Soviet submarine designer Dr. Rady Shamkov.
Our subs are very fast, very maneuverable. They can reach greater depths in comparison with the American ones.
It's K-19's thick hull that allows her to submerge to a depth where NATO's sonar buoys cannot hear. Captain Zativ knows this and takes his sub deeper, to 750 feet. Captain Zativ's tactics work. He passes through the NATO barrier undetected and enters the North Atlantic. He must now remain hidden until the next stage of his mission. June 21st, 1961, Moscow. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev lashes out against the West.
Everyone knows that we don't want war. But if you really threaten us with war, we do not fear such a threat. If you unleash a war, this will mean suicide for you.
Khrushchev believes his nuclear arsenal will force the West to back down. June 28, 1961, Washington, D.C. Kennedy responds.
The, quote, crisis, unquote, over Berlin is Soviet manufactured. For many years, the Western nations have proposed a permanent and peaceful settlement of such questions on the basis of self-determination of the German people.
That same day in the Norwegian Sea, the Soviet Navy is brazenly on the move. Operation Arctic Circle, involving a large force of Soviet submarines and surface ships, is underway right in NATO's backyard. American naval intelligence is on alert. It's the first time the Soviet Navy has moved such a large force out of area. NATO intelligence and naval forces are keeping a close eye on the Soviets. June 30th, 1961. While on patrol near Iceland, Captain Zativ celebrates his 35th birthday.
The officers were wishing me happy birthday when the radio officer brought in a message from Moscow ordering us to leave the waiting point and to proceed with the plan.
K-19's role is to imitate an American nuclear missile submarine.
В Норвежском море на вероятном маршруте.
A group of diesel submarines of the Northern Fleet was positioned in the Norwegian Sea, along the predicted route of the US submarine, thus forming a screen.
Foxtrot submarine commander Grigory Vassar is part of the pack that will try to hunt down K-19.
Our Gromyka subdivision was represented by 3 submarines. All the other submarines were from other formations, probably around 30.
If she manages to outfox her hunters, K-19 will move on to the next stage of her mission, a practice missile launch at a target in the Russian north. Taking on his role as the captain of an American missile submarine, Zativ travels under the pack ice to avoid detection. His route will take him between Greenland and Iceland, through the ice-clogged waters of the Denmark Strait.
We saw massive icebergs along our course, even on 600 and 1,000 feet depth. No guarantee that we would not bump into one of those icebergs.
K-19's 2 nuclear reactors are working flawlessly. The heat generated by the nuclear reaction is producing steam to power the sub's propellers.
The reactor is under very high working pressure. This makes it possible for the heat transfer agent's temperature to reach about 300 degrees Fahrenheit.
But its closed system is under very high pressure, just like a car's radiator. One small leak could spell disaster. The mission is proceeding according to plan. K-19, the pride of the Soviet fleet, is proving her worth.
I was at the Central Command Post. I checked the course plotted by the navigator. Everything was fine, so I went to my cabin here in compartment 2.
Captain Zativ sleeps. 2 hours pass. July 4th, 1961, 04:15 hours. Zativ is rudely awakened. There's an emergency in the reactor room.
A report came in from the control panel. Pressure in the first perimeter at 0, compensating baffled at 0. That's the worst thing that can happen to any working reactor.
Captain Zativ rushes to the sub's central command post. The chief of electrical engineering, Vladimir Pogorolov, is struggling to bring the situation under control.
All breakdowns, whether in our Navy or in the US Navy, are always caused by the same type of thing. The reactor is under very high working pressure. This makes it possible for the heat transfer agent's temperature to reach about 300 degrees Fahrenheit. On July 4th, at the depths of 400 feet, the man in charge of the reactor saw by the manometer that the pressure was falling to 0. That was how it all started.
Captain Zativ is told the reactor is leaking radiation and isn't responding to the crew's commands. He goes to the reactor control room to see the situation for himself. He discovers the problem is getting worse.
An instant rise of temperature in the inner tubes of the reactor. According to the manual, we were facing an inevitable heat explosion.
The reactor isn't being cooled. If the core temperature continues to climb, it will cause an instant steam release, followed by a meltdown.
Under normal conditions, heat is removed at 660 degrees Fahrenheit. But when pressure's falling, the whole reactor starts boiling, which creates instant pressure which, in its turn, can cause a general explosion.
K-19 is no longer a stealthy underwater weapon. She's turned into a floating nuclear bomb. Zativ orders his crew to surface and send an SOS to Moscow. With the Soviets and the Americans on the verge of war over Berlin, Captain Nikolai Zativ faces a nuclear catastrophe at sea. July 4th, American Independence Day. In Moscow, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev pays a surprise visit to the U.S. Embassy. He knows the state of affairs between the two nations is precarious and wants to take the political temperature firsthand. 1,900 miles away in the Norwegian Sea, K-19 is disabled and adrift. Captain Zativ knows he must reach naval headquarters to report the crisis. Something is very wrong with one of K-19's reactors. It's beginning to leak radiation. Vladimir Braganec was a petty officer on K-19.
I was at the Central Command post. A breakdown alert was sounded and a radiation poisoning hazard declared. We had no way of knowing the specific dose.
Captain Zativ gathers his engineers in the control room just outside the contaminated reactor compartment. Then, more bad news. The radio operator cannot raise Moscow. Seawater has seeped through the seals of the long-range antenna. They're on their own. No one will be coming to their rescue. One of K-19's youngest officers comes up with an emergency plan that may save the submarine.
Lieutenant Engineer Yuri Filin was the one who has come up with an optimal solution. His proposal was to route a support water pipe to the oxygen removal system of the reactor.
In theory, the plan could work, but it will require pipes to be welded in the reactor room itself. Under the circumstances, it's their only option. The men must now assemble the necessary repair equipment, including pipes, hoses, gas masks, radiation suits, and an electric welder. K-19's backup diesel engines must be started to power the electric arc welder. But it takes precious minutes to move equipment to the reactor control compartment. The reactor's core temperature continues to rise. With no time to waste, the men decide to connect a rubber hose to the emergency cooling pump.
The reactor responded by tearing the rubber hose to shreds. That was when the first serious damage was done. The overheated reactor revolted when the cold water was fed into it, and that whole rubber system just fell apart, and the men got their first hefty dose of radiation.
The first attempt to fix the cooling problem has only made the crisis worse. Radiation levels are also rising outside the reactor compartment. The reactor room officer, Lieutenant Captain Mikhail Krashkov, implores Zativ to leave. Radiation is starting to spread. July 4th, 1961, 0650. The welding team prepares to enter the radioactive compartment. Yuri Erdogan, Yevgeny Kashenkov, Nikolai Safkin, Simon Penkov, and Valery Karnatonov. They have no idea of the horror that awaits them. With the welding equipment in place, 2 teams of 3 men will now make a second attempt to fix the cooling system, this time with a metal pipe. The high radiation levels force the teams to work in 10-minute shifts.
No one knew what was to follow. You couldn't see the danger, you couldn't put a finger on it. That was why the men went in willingly, first because they were not aware of the consequences, and were just doing their jobs.
Gauges show the temperature inside the reactor has reached 750 degrees Fahrenheit, technically the maximum before an explosion. It continues to climb, but the reactor holds. Alone and adrift in NATO waters, the pride of the Soviet Navy is on the verge of a nuclear meltdown. The lives of 139 crewmen are now on the line. Now, Captain Zativ must order more men into the contaminated reactor room to finish the job. He knows these men will die. One man relieves him of this terrible responsibility. Lieutenant Boris Korchilov volunteers.
I asked Boris, "Do you know what to expect?" "Yes," was his reply. "You know, it's not easy sending men to their deaths. I knew he was likely to get a lethal dose."
Boris Korchilov takes the place of his colleague Mikhail Krashikov. The welding team has almost finished installing the jury-rigged cooling pipe. Now, the moment of truth. The improvised cooling system is switched on. Four hours into the crisis, the temperature begins to drop. Lieutenant Korchilov's team has done its job, but success has been bought at a terrible price. Inside the reactor room, the air is no longer oxygen, but a violet glow of ionized hydrogen. The shock cooling of the reactor results in a massive release of radiation. The men have all received a lethal dose.
When he came out, he was throwing up yellowish-white bile. We reached down to support him, and he reported that the task had been accomplished. Even as we watched, within 1 hour they started swelling. Especially the faces. The eyes looked like they were running down their cheeks. The lips looked turned inside out. Soon they couldn't talk anymore. They could only moan. At first they seemed okay. Then they started vomiting yellowish liquid. Then lost all their hair within a very short time. Then the skin on their faces started bursting, and they started swelling up. It looked like logs. It was too late.
In the end, the selfless actions and expertise of a handful of volunteers saves the rest of the crew. The reactor is now under control, but the ordeal is not yet over. Radioactive contamination is spreading throughout the submarine. Captain Zativ knows he must do something, or his entire crew will die. July 4th, 1961, 0900. The Soviet Union's top-secret ballistic missile submarine K-19 is crippled and adrift in NATO waters. The reactor's cooling system has been temporarily repaired, but lethal radiation levels are climbing throughout the submarine.
I thought that no one throughout the whole history of the Navy had such a task. Every minute in the radioactive zone was bringing us closer to the fatal threshold, that point of no return already crossed by Boris Korchilov and his team.
Oblivious to the plight of K-19, the Soviet submarines and ships involved in the war games continue with their exercises. They expect K-19 to be in the area, playing the role of a stealthy American missile sub. Little do they know that K-19 and her crew are desperately trying to radio them for help. Repairs to the long-range radial aerial have failed. Their only chance remains a weak SOS signal from their backup transmitter.
We were transmitting distress call through our radio transmitter. There was no answer, no response whatsoever. The wait was nerve-wracking. Isn't there anyone at all who can help? I lost all hope.
Zativ must somehow get his crew off K-19. He heads southeast under emergency power towards the nearby Soviet fleet. Now, instead of evading his wargame adversaries, he's gambling they will find him. While heading southeast, two of Zativ's senior officers confront him with a very different idea.
They tried to convince me that we had better head north towards Jan Mayen to put the crew ashore and sink the sub. That was like a scene from a bad pirate movie. And now I have a new fear gnawing at me. What if they ignite the crewmen to violence?
K-19 is the first of her class, a top-secret design. The U.S. Navy isn't even aware of her existence. If salvaged by NATO forces, it would be a major intelligence coup and a political embarrassment for the Soviets.
I could not afford to disembark on the island where, according to our intelligence, a NATO naval base could have been located. I would rather die than surrender our first nuclear underwater giant.
Sensing mutiny, Captain Zativ orders all firearms thrown overboard. All except for 5 pistols, which are distributed to his most trusted officers. Anyone who disobeys will be shot. "200 miles away, Foxtrot Commander Grigory Vassar takes his submarine to the surface.
As we surfaced for a scheduled communication session, we received a radiogram. The transmission was very weak. The radiogram stated that there had been a reactor breakdown and that they needed help.
Captain Zativ's gamble pays off. K-19's SOS has been heard, but there's a problem.
And gave the location at 66 degrees northern latitude and 4 degrees longitude. But it didn't say whether western or eastern.
The difference between 4 degrees east and 4 degrees west longitude that far north is close to 200 miles. Guessing, Captain Vassar and another Foxtrot submarine make their way northwest on the surface at full speed. The decision will either take them towards K-19 or further away. Meanwhile, aboard the sub, no one can escape the radiation poisoning. Captain Zativ orders the sickest men up on deck.
When the badly injured were being carried out, we were all watching. But by that time, we were past caring. We were also feeling weak and headachy and sick to our stomachs, and they were lying there. We looked at them once, twice, but what could we do?
The rescuers are finally spotted on the horizon. K-19 and her crew are no longer alone. Vassar's decision to head for 4 degrees west was lucky.
I saw the sub lying to. Most of the crew were out on deck. The commander and the signalman were up on the bridge with 2 more men. Out of those who were on deck, some were lying down, others sitting. Many were being sick, right there on deck.
Zativ knows he has to get his men off the sub and to medical attention as soon as possible. He radios via the rescue sub for instructions and waits for a response. Moscow is paralyzed by indecision and doesn't reply. July 5th, 1961, 0300. With no instructions from Moscow, Captain Zativ takes matters into his own hands. He transfers his men to the rescue submarines. The move is a difficult procedure in the heavy ocean swells. K-19 and the rescue submarine are moored together. By extending their front diving planes, the crew can be transferred to the other sub.
Those injured the worst, 11 people in all, were taken aboard the first submarine. They were all completely bedridden, in very poor condition, as they had received a huge radiation dose.
The first rescue submarine leaves for base with most of K-19's crew. July 5th, 1961, 0400. Captain Zativ and 1 officer remain on K-19. Zativ now makes a decision that he knows may cost him his command. He decides to abandon the Soviet Union's only nuclear missile submarine.
How would my actions be judged back home? It would be so easy to label us with the cowards and prosecute. Moscow might say it wasn't a fire, nor was it a hole in the hull, but you've abandoned the ship. It is so easy to judge our actions sitting in a warm office in Moscow. Zatayev was the last off the ship, as a captain should.
Captain Zativ orders the remaining rescue submarine to load torpedoes and be prepared to fire. If NATO forces try to capture K-19, he will order his own submarine torpedoed and sent to the bottom.
He told me that he, together with the commander of submarine S-270, which had beaten us there, had decided to get ready 2 combat torpedoes, just in case someone tried to seize the sub. They would have self-destructed rather than surrender the submarine.
In fact, U.S. naval intelligence does know that something is wrong in the Norwegian Sea, that a Soviet submarine is in trouble.
In the event that NATO Navy forces attempt to enter K-19, I will personally command the torpedo attack. Commander of K-19, Captain Nikolai Zatayev. Time, July 5th, 1961, 0500 hours.
Then, a message from Moscow. Another sub is on its way to guard the stricken boat. The rest of K-19's sick and dying crew are going home. The ordeal is over. However, Zativ fears another awaits him when he returns to the Soviet Union. K-19 is completely contaminated by the time she's towed back to base. One of her 2 reactors is destroyed. But the Soviet leaders decide that she's too valuable to be scrapped. They order her designers to rebuild her, a massive, hazardous undertaking that takes 3 years to complete. 2 months after the disaster, the Soviet Navy test fires K-19's contaminated missiles to determine how radiation has affected them. They perform flawlessly. In the end, it was the speed of K-19's construction and sloppy welding which led to a fatal flaw, one that First Officer Vladimir Vagonov only finds out about years later.
K-19 was built in less than a year. That was why, in all that haste, an electric welder screwed up. So a drop from an electrode got onto the pipeline of the first circuit of the starboard atomic reactor.
The Soviets don't acknowledge the deadly incident aboard K-19. Just weeks after she's towed back to port, they boast that missile-armed atomic submarines are the backbone of its navy. In fact, K-19, the Soviets' first and only atomic-powered missile submarine, is crippled and out of action. The K-19 disaster deprives the Soviets of a key component of their nuclear arsenal at the height of the Cold War. Then another setback. New U.S. satellite technology replaces vulnerable spy planes like the U-2. America now has a space-based view of the Soviet Union with the highly secret Corona satellite. At the time, Western intelligence believes the Soviets have as many as 250 intercontinental ballistic missile sites. Satellite intelligence confirms the Soviets have been lying about their nuclear superiority. Instead of hundreds of missile sites, only 15 are found. Kennedy calls Khrushchev's nuclear bluff and refuses to back down over Berlin. July 25, 1961, Washington, D.C.
I hear it said that West Berlin is militarily untenable. And so was Bastogne, and so in fact was Stalingrad. Any dangerous spot is tenable if men, brave men, will make it so. Those who threaten to unleash the forces of war on a dispute over West Berlin should recall the words of the ancient philosopher, a man who causes fear cannot be free from fear.
The crisis reaches a stalemate when the Soviets have to fall back to Plan B, construction of the infamous Berlin Wall. K-19 once again becomes operational in 1965 after being decontaminated and undergoing an extensive rebuild. She's converted to launch missiles from beneath the sea, a vital part of the Soviet Union's nuclear submarine strategic force. K-19's reactor crisis results in an immediate design change for all Soviet nuclear-powered submarines. Emergency reactor cooling systems become standard equipment. As for K-19, she rusts in a remote northern harbor on the Kola Peninsula, waiting to be scrapped. In an ironic twist, the people of Russia still lionize the submarine, remembered as a symbol of the nation's sacrifice against a powerful Cold War adversary. The men who survived the K-19 disaster owe their lives to the handful of sailors who selflessly did their duty and sacrificed their own lives. Boris Korchalov, Yuri Erdogan, Yevgeny Kashenkov, Nikolai Savkin, Simon Penkov, Valery Karnatonov, Boris Ryzhkov, and Yuri Postev.
I, for one, think that the men who went in with their eyes open, being fully aware of the horrible consequences, those were the real heroes. The team that did the welding, they all died afterwards. In my book, they are all genuine heroes. The way the crew handled it was not only heroic, it was also very expert. In order to avert the worst possible thing that can happen if an atomic reactor is left without water, they jury-rigged a reactor water cooling system, which was not part of the original design.
Despite his fears and uncertainty about his fate, Captain Nikolai Zativ is not singled out for punishment. He continues his naval career. Captain Nikolai Zativ dies in 1998. He's buried in a Moscow cemetery with the other members of his crew. Those who died on K-19 are memorialized as martyrs, casualties in a Cold War that had far more losses than history records.